Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the first episode for the speaker series of Gen Z Jews. In this series, I will be interviewing national leaders on the topic of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, our guest is former Deputy Secretary for the U.S. Health and Human Services Department, presidential scholar, and author of his new book, Fight House, Rivalries in the White House, From Truman to Trump, Dr. Tevi Troy. Welcome.
Hey, Zach, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited about Gen Z Jews.
That's great. So thank you for agreeing to be interviewed by my small organization. So before we turn to our main topic for today, I wanted to mention your new book, Fight House, Rivalries in the White House, From Truman to Trump. And so people have a lot of time to read this summer because of quarantine. And so could you tell us of a rivalry in the White House that you think was good for the country?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because what we hear in the news today is all about, people are fighting in the White House, isn't it awful? But you are really getting on to a wise point, which is sometimes rivalries can be good for the country and for the presidency. Let me give you the opposite, which is when you have the absence of rivalry, sometimes you have a problem, as in the Lyndon Johnson administration. Johnson would not allow discussion or disagreement on the Vietnam War, and therefore we didn't necessarily have the best policies, because he was very hostile to people coming up with different ideas. And in fact, there was a group of aides at the State Department that was skeptical of the Vietnam effort, but they were so scared of Johnson that they called themselves the non-group, and they met at secret times. An interesting example of a rivalry that I might say is positive for the country was in the Bill Clinton administration. Clinton was elected in 1992 as a moderate Democrat. He's part of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, which was supposed to bring the Democrats back to the center after their 3 straight election losses to Reagan twice and to Bush. And Clinton was even chairman of this group. But when he becomes president, he presides over an administration that is drifting significantly to the left. I think it was too far to the left for Clinton, but it was definitely too far to the left for the country. And there was a correction in the 1994 election. The Republicans took over both the House and the Senate for the first time in 40 years. This is the so-called Gingrich Revolution, or the Republican Revolution in 1994. And Bill Clinton brings in a secret advisor into the White House, nicknamed Charlie, codenamed Charlie. And the White House aides don't know who this person is, but he is bringing advice that tacks Clinton more to the center. Now, George Stephanopoulos and Harold Ickes, who are liberal White House aides who don't like the advice Charlie is giving, they eventually discover that Charlie is Dick Morris, who is a political consultant who is now, I think, drifted over to full-on Republican, but he started in the Democratic Party, and at the time he was probably a conservative Democrat. And Morris and Stephanopoulos are fighting with, Stephanopoulos and Ickes are fighting with Morris at every turn. And they have nasty jokes about him, and they make fun of him, and he has an aide in the White House, and they play jokes on him, like not telling when meetings are starting and not telling where meetings are. So they act in nasty ways. However, I think that the results, meaning Clinton tacked to the center and he was able to triangulate, as it was called, I think the results were good for the country, and they were good for Bill Clinton. He won re-election in 1996. And even George Stephanopoulos, who was so critical of Morris and was part of that team making fun of him, he acknowledged in his own memoir that is not positive towards Morris, that Clinton got better results out of his staff as a result of bringing in the Morris influence.
Wow. That's really interesting.
Thanks. Lots
So
more like it in the White House.
So as the former United States Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services in President George W. Bush's administration, do you think that your Judaism hindered or encouraged your chances at taking on this position?
Well, I think Judaism is clearly helpful to me in my career, in my understanding of what matters, and oftentimes in advancing my career. So, for example, when I was at the White House and I was up for this position of Deputy Secretary, I'm an outwardly Orthodox Jew. People know I'm religiously observant. And I had to sit down with the White House counsel, Harriet Miers, and she had to ask about all sorts of behaviors that sometimes nominees have engaged in that could get them in trouble when it comes to a nomination process. You obviously don't want the president or the administration embarrassed by the past histories of people. And the list of questions was about use of certain substances and engagement in certain behaviors. And she starts going through the list, and she stops and she says, Tevi, I know that you're a religious and pious person. I'm sure you've never done any of these things. And she kind of put the paper away. And so in that way, and obviously I have never done any of these things, but in that way, the faith that people had in me because of my own faith, I think enhanced my chances of getting this very prestigious job.
And as a follow-up, do you think that this would be different today, either because of American culture or the administration?
Yeah, I am concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism and ways that it could potentially be problematic. I have not yet seen it kibosh a political appointment, just naked anti-Semitism getting someone out of a job. But you are starting to see hints of problems. So, for example, when Barry Weiss resigned from the New York Times this week, she talked about how there was criticism at the New York Times, which, by the way, is a very Jewish paper and is owned by a Jewish family, but she said that she was being criticized for, quote, writing about the Jews again. So I think that kind of anti-Semitism is starting to rear its ugly head, and is something that we should be watchful for and try and stamp it out as much as possible.
Okay, cool. So you were also the liaison to the Jewish community during the Bush administration. And so with today's rising anti-Semitism, as you talked about, what advice would you have for the White House Jewish liaison today?
I think my advice today would be the same as the advice then, which is have an open door, be willing to listen to everybody. That doesn't mean you have to take all their advice, but you should be listening to people from different perspectives. And the number one piece of advice I got when I took the role as White House liaison back in 2002 or so was from my predecessor, who said, whatever decision you make, you should have a Talmudic rationale for it. Meaning you should be able to explain logically why this group was invited to the meeting and that group wasn't. Why this person was seated next to the president and that person was seated across from it. And it actually imposes a certain discipline on you. You're not just making decisions randomly or at a whim. You have to think about why you're making the decisions, because you know, with a community as active and as vocal and as verbal as the Jewish community, that you're going to have to explain.
Interesting. So you also wrote about disaster management and the White House. And so we're living in a disaster situation now. So do you believe that only the White House, do you believe that any White House can be prepared to handle the next disaster?
Well, I'd actually argue that we're facing three disasters, not one. In my book, Shall We Wake the President, I talk about different types of disasters that presidents can face. One, and my first chapter is on the pandemic threat, and in fact, in my book, which came out in 2016, I warned about coronavirus and said we don't have countermeasures for coronavirus, we don't have antivirals, we don't have a vaccine platform, and we need to get those things. So That's one type of disaster. A second type of disaster I talk about in Shall We Wake the President is urban unrest, which we have seen in recent weeks. And in the 1960s, there was actually riots in every single summer of Lyndon Johnson administration. It was so bad that when Pat Moynihan, who was a Nixon aide, came to the White House, the Johnson aides gave him a mimeographed pad for calling out the National Guard in case of riots, and all you had to do was fill out the name of the city and the president's signature, and the National Guard would go to that city. That's how bad and how frequent it was in the 60s. The third type of disaster we're facing now is economic collapse. We are going through a terrible economic period induced by the disease, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a disastrous economic situation, and that's another type of disaster I talk about in Shall We Wake the President. I don't know that any president can handle three disasters at once. It's a lot to take on. But I think in my book, Shall We Wake the President, I do lay out strategies for the president to engage in, to deal with all these types of disasters, while at the same time giving advice to you. And this is, I think, important to the Gen Z Jews and the whole Gen Z generation. I give advice to individuals for how they should prepare for these kinds of disasters, because if something bad happens, the federal government's not going to come to your house and solve your problem. They might be working on a large, big-scale solution like injecting many into the Federal Reserve or coming up with a vaccine. But they're not actually delivering the assistance to your individual house. And so you, as an individual, need to be thinking about how to prepare for the disaster. And so in Shall We Wake the President, I talk about what the presidents need to do, but I also talk about what you as an individual need to do as well.
Did you ever expect three of those disasters to happen at the same time?
To be honest, no. I think history is always surprising us. But at the same time, if you're president, you've got to be prepared for this kind of thing. And it is not surprising that some of these things follow the others. So, for example, when COVID first struck, one of my first concerns was, is this going to be followed by urban unrest? And for the first month or two, I said, this is a problem, but we've been lucky in that we haven't had urban unrest or civil disobedience. And then, obviously, in the third month, stuff did break out. Mm-hmm. So I think the thing about disasters is they do kind of mesh together. The disease obviously causes economic collapse. You have a weather disaster like a major hurricane, sometimes looting follows. So these things do come together, unfortunately. And to be a president, you have to prepare for what they call in the military a multi-front war.
Okay. And because Donald Trump is facing these three disasters at once now, do you think that this will prepare future presidents to be more ready?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're going to put a lot of work and a lot of money into dealing with pandemic threats in the future. I think some of that money actually may be poorly spent, as pandemic threats are a threat, but they really don't come every year. They come more like every generation. And so we're going to be spending money in 2020 saying, this can never happen again. And we may not see another type of pandemic disease outbreak till 2040 or 2060. And in fact, this current disease outbreak, some people said was overdue, because the last time we had a big flu that was this problematic was 68, 69. And then obviously there was the great influenza of 1918, 19. So I think we are going to put a lot of money into pandemic mitigation in the future. I don't know that we're going to have any future president more prepared, but I think the lessons of history are instructive for future presidents in learning how to deal with the problems they face.
Cool. And so, as a final question, in January of 2001, you wrote an article entitled "My Boss the Fanatic" about John Ashcroft's relations with the Jews on his staff. Do you think that the fact that he was a devout Christian is what led to his acceptance of the Jews on his staff and their culture and customs?
I think that there is an affiliation and an understanding between religious communities. James Davison Hunter wrote a fascinating book in the 80s called Culture Wars, and he said that an Orthodox Jew and an Orthodox Christian may have more in common now and in the future than, let's say, a religious Jew, an Orthodox Jew, and a non-religious Jew, or an Orthodox or an evangelical Christian and a secular Christian. And so I think there is kind of a community of understanding between varieties of faith, and I do think that his adherence to strict principles in his own Christian faith, I think, helped him understand the strict adherence to Jewish customs as well. And I think that was helpful to me as someone on his staff, but also helpful to him to understand the needs of the Jewish community. One other thing, he was a member of the Assemblies of God, which is a evangelical Christian group that has been discriminated against in the past, and I think that also helped him understand the discrimination that Jews face sometimes in the form of anti-Semitism.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming on to the series. I really appreciate it. So, thank you.
All right, thanks for having me, and I hope all the Gen Z Jews go out and read Fight House.
Thank you.
Bye.